Welcome to the 30th Annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson on the journalism faculty at the university. Tonight we have the joy of having Jesmyn Ward, a writer of great acclaim who's won the National Book Award twice, recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, author of novels Salvage the Bones, Where the Line Bleeds, Sing, Unburied, Sing, and most recently, Let Us Descend, along with her memoir, Men We Reaped. Jesmyn Ward, welcome to the Writers' Symposium.
Thank you for having me.
Do you feel welcome?
Yes, I feel very welcome.
Okay, all right. You know, so much of your writing deals with struggle, family struggle, society struggle, internal struggle. Do you think the way you came into the world at 2 pounds, not expected to survive, is the root of all this?
You know, no one's ever asked me that before.
Jesmyn, you're at the Writers' Symposium now. You think they're, I'm serious, did you think they're related?
No, I think it's probably, I think, part of it, right? You know, when I was growing up, I always understood, because my mom and my dad would tell me the story of my birth over and over again. So I guess I always understood that, you know, from the beginning, things were not so easy for me, right? You know, I remember being a kid and they would tell me, they would say, the doctor said that you were going to die. The doctor said that you were going to die, which is, you know, it's a very straightforward, sort of harsh thing to tell a 5-year-old, but they told me that.
So eat your vegetables.
Right. Right. But then they would always follow up with, and especially my dad, he would be like, but I knew that they were wrong. Like, I knew that you were a fighter. I knew that you would fight. And then he would say, and you did, right? And that's why you're here now. So I feel like it's part of the narrative, right? That that both my parents really sort of told me about myself. You know, that I was a fighter, even before I think I ever thought of myself in those terms.
But your dad saw that before the medical staff saw it.
Right.
What did he see?
I don't know. I feel like it was just, I don't know, belief, or I don't know, maybe he saw something of my spirit or my essence, or what I would become. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to ask him. Early on, you said you read a lot, and you said you read to escape. And I know something about your backstory, but what were you trying to escape from when you were reading as a child?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, you know, my generations of my family, you know, have lived in South Mississippi, and we've always been poor, right? We've always sort of, even though everyone worked really hard, right, we still existed somewhere around the poverty line. And so when I learned how to read, I was actually living, you know, with my immediate family, and, you know, my mom and my dad and my siblings, in my grandmother's house, right? My grandmother, she had a 4-bedroom house, and they converted her dining room into a bedroom, and I was living there with my, you know, parents, my family. My 2 aunts were also living there. My 4 uncles were living there, right? So there were a lot of us in a very...
That's a dormitory.
Yes, very small space. You know, and it was the house that we were living in, my grandmother had basically built with my grandfather. So it was an older home. There was no central air, there was no central heat, there was a big wood burning stove in the living room, and that's where we got all our heat from. You know, there were a lot of us, and times were tough. And so I think I wanted to escape some of that. And I'm naturally, I don't know, a shyer person. And I think I was even, shyer and introverted even when I was a kid. And so to sit with a book and to immerse myself in the world, when I was reading with one character or a set of characters, it was a sort of a reprieve for me, I think, and offered me this time to, be alone and live in this imaginative sort of space.
We've got this great description of reading as a child where you said you wanted to read where good and evil were clearly delineated, where you found girls who were strong and smart and creative and foolish enough to fight dragons, to run away from home, to live in museums, to become child spies, to make new friends and build secret gardens. It's just such a beautiful description of why we read. What were some of the books?
I loved From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Bosley Frankweiler, Harriet the Spy. One of my favorites, which I was reading when I was younger, and I reread it again and again as I got older and realized when I was like a teenager that there was so much about it that I did not get when I was a kid, but it was Robin McKinley's The Hero and the Crown, which I think that what really resonated for me about that book when I was younger was the character at the center of that book is this girl whose mother died when she was young, and her father, he's still alive, but she just feels very lonely, and I think that she feels invisible, in the world that she exists in. So she spent so much of the book she spends trying to sort of find a way to be useful or a way to be seen or a purpose, and she does, but I think it was that feeling of invisibility that, for whatever reason, because I wasn't invisible, but I identified with that feeling, and also she felt very lonely, and so something about that resonated with me too.
You just thought, I'm not the only person who has these feelings.
Right.
Yeah, sure. When you were in college, I saw that you tried to write short stories, and you even called yourself a failed poet. Why a failed poet?
Because I actually wrote poetry before I wrote fiction. Like I wrote bad poetry all throughout high school.
I think bad poetry in high school is sort of a redundant term.
Right. And then I continued in that endeavor when I went to college. There was something about how the poetic, how poems are so, they're by necessity, they are short. There's a lot of impact. They're carefully crafted. They don't take up a lot of space. And I think, because I'm a novelist, that form, it was just difficult. It was difficult for me to fit what I was thinking and what I was feeling and what I wanted to explore in that form. Even though I actually have, I guess, not so secret desire to one day publish a book of poems, hopefully good poems, but I would have to write them in order to maybe publish them.
We aren't going to be hauling out those high school ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, but I think one of the ways you were critical of your own writing early on is you said you wrote pages of extended scenes, the dialogue was flat and felt fake. What turned it? When did you get good?
I went to Stanford, and I took my first creative writing classes in fiction, where we were specifically studying the short story. And so I think it was, my experience in those classes where my instructors began to teach me how to read like a writer, right? How to read a short story and be aware of how it's working. I think then when I began to, just begin to better understand how a story is constructed, that I was able to begin to apply that to my own ideas.
Yeah, that makes total sense. But what I thought was almost, it struck me funny, but all your friends at Stanford who are majoring in economics and political science, they're getting jobs, they're getting everything, and you're just kind of languishing as this literature, short story person. What was it the cashier at Macy's told you that made you cry?
Right. He was an English major too. He was like, yeah, I was an English major too. And I was like, oh my God. I'm looking at my future right now.
And still, you were drawn to creative writing and literature.
Yeah, I was. I don't mean to, to be a bummer, but losing my brother shortly after I graduated, that really changed everything for me. Because before he died, I was invested in, doing what others wanted me to do, right? I was the first person in my immediate family to go to a 4-year college or a 4-year university. And so, my family, they had, they had these desires for me, because in the end, they just wanted me to be at least secure and monetarily successful, right? So they wanted me to be a lawyer or be a doctor, and I told one of the groups that we met with earlier, I was like, I was terrible at math, but my mom was convinced that I would be a pediatrician. But that was not for me. But still, I felt some push, to do something practical, right, with my education, even though I was an English major. But I loved story. And when my brother passed, it made me sort of think about life differently, right? And I suffer from a fear of flying. And so I remember being on a flight and panicking, right? And asking myself, okay, so what am I gonna do with this life that I have, right? With this time that I've been given that my brother was not. And the thing that immediately, the word that popped into my head was, or the sentence was, writing. You're gonna be a writer. And so we landed successfully.
Wait a second. You got you're gonna be a writer while you were having a panic attack on a flight?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
You got to pay attention to that voice. That's amazing.
Yeah. And so then I began. I was like, well, I owe it to myself to at least try. I might fail, right? But I'm going to try. And so then I began reading more extensively, and I began, making a habit out of writing, right? I began to try to develop some sort of discipline around the practice of writing.
So is that when you went back to grad school? And said, okay, I gotta get after this? Well,
I spent around, it was when I was in New York City. So I spent around 2 years reading and just reading everything that I could, I spent a lot of time reading, and then also just writing short stories again.
Okay. There are some wonderful scenes in your novels where the main characters are visited by spirits, people who have since passed, and in fact, one of your novels, one of those spirits gets his own chapters, and you actually speak from that person's point of view. What are you tapping into when you're writing that way? Is that part of your own kind of personal beliefs as well, that are the spirits of our ancestors are still speaking to us, and maybe even in communication in some way?
Mm-hmm. I think that's part of it, because I believe that someone remains, that something remains, even after they've passed away. I also grew up in a family and in a community where people believed that, right? Like that was, they believed in the reality of spirit, in the fact that there was a spiritual world, that there was something beyond the physical plane, that people who have died and who have gone beyond, that they can come back and visit you. I tell this story about one of my great-grandparents, one of my great-grandmothers on my mom's dad's side. People tend to have kids young where I'm from. So I knew many of my great-grandparents, right, when I was younger. And so one of my great-grandmothers, we would visit her, and then afterwards we would just sit and spend time with her on her porch. And she would always tell us this story about how my great-grandfather, her husband, died. And after he died, he came back as a ghost, as a spirit, and he had a conversation with her. And he told her to never remarry. And she never remarried.
Of course he did. What do you make of that?
Yeah, when I was a kid, she would tell this story, and every time she would tell it, I'd be like, yep, that's exactly how it works. That makes total sense. These are all facts. And that's the kind of family and that's the kind of community that I was brought up in. And so I remember when I was writing Salvage the Bones, that there's a scene in Salvage the Bones where Skeeta, who's one of the main characters in that book, he has a pet pit bull, which he trains to fight, right? And so at one moment in the book, he's out in the woods and he's training his dog, China. And Esh, who is the main character who tells the story, she's his sister, she's back at home and she hears China, her brother's pit bull, barking in the distance. And then at the same time, she suddenly hears it's like a chorus of dogs in the neighborhood, in the area, right? And she can't see them, but they all start barking at once. And I remember writing that scene and then stopping for a second and thinking, something is happening here. Like something strange or supernatural or spiritual is happening in this moment. And part of me wanted for Esh to go out and figure it out, right? So I felt this, I wanted to write about that weird supernatural moment, but then I thought, no, that's not this story, right? That's not right for this story. It's not organic to this story and to this moment. And so I just, I returned to Esh and her point of view and continued with that story. And so in Sing Unburied Sing, I decided that was the right moment to sort of follow that urge and that impulse that I had, because I think, I wanted the people that I write about and the way that they think about the world, especially in Sing Unburied Sing, I wanted it to better reflect how I think my family members see the world and think about the world, and how people in my community see the world and think about the world.
So to follow up on that, one of the reasons you wrote Salvage the Bones, I think, is you wanted to address the issue of people not leaving during Hurricane Katrina.
Right.
And, the way they were portrayed, they were just idiots for not leaving or going back. And you wanted to more accurately say, no, this is what was going on then. And is that correct, that was one of your motives?
Yep, that is correct. Yeah, because after Hurricane Katrina occurred, and I was home for Hurricane Katrina. After it occurred, I remember just being in, different spaces where I would overhear people talking about Hurricane Katrina, overhear people talking about people who didn't evacuate for Hurricane Katrina, and they just had very negative things to say about them, right? Like you're saying, they thought that they were ignorant, that they were ill-informed, they thought that they were also, stupid for returning afterwards and choosing to rebuild, and that I hated it, right? Like hearing those conversations and seeing the ways that the people who I love and who I care about were sort of reduced to these stereotypes. And so I wanted to, in part the reason that I wrote Salvage the Bones is because I wanted to write about people, who are like the people in my community and like people in my family who don't leave, right? Who never leave, right? Every year there's a hurricane season, right? Who couldn't leave, who don't have the resources to leave. I think that was really frustrating to me. That was probably one of the more frustrating elements of that conversation that I heard and again, is because people just assumed that everyone has the resources, right, to leave. And so many people that I know who I grew up with, you don't, right? You don't have the resources to, move yourself and your immediate family. You definitely don't have the resources to move your extended family. So it was problematic for me. So I wanted to push back against that and really, hopefully, sort of deepen the reader's understanding of what life is like for the people, who are from where I'm from.
Sure. You've been put in this genre of Southern writers of some pretty amazing people. When people speak of you, they speak of Eudora Welty, they speak of Flannery O'Connor, they speak of William Faulkner, Toni Morrison. I think there was something about Faulkner's As I Lay Dying that triggered something in you. What was that?
I read As I Lay Dying for the first time when I was studying at the University of Michigan. And I had attempted to read Faulkner and I'd read The Sound and the Fury at that point.
You don't start with Sound and Fury. Just saying.
That's what I started with. Started with The Sound and the Fury. Well, I actually started with some of his short stories when I was in undergrad. And so I read like The Bear, right? And I could recognize that it was brilliant, right? And it was difficult, but there was no resonance. It didn't resonate with me. It didn't make me feel. And then I read The Sound and the Fury, and again, I could recognize the brilliance of it, but it didn't make me feel. But for whatever reason, I think that part of it is I had to grow as a reader, right? I had to mature as a reader. And so when I read As I Lay Dying, when I was in my mid to late 20s, there was something about the beauty of his prose, the power of the figurative language, that I read, the first couple pages, and I had to stop because it was too much. I recognized it so clearly as home, and there was something about the South that he was communicating. I don't know, it just felt so present, and it felt so real to me that I had to put it down for a second, because I was like, this is amazing. And then I picked it back up and I continued reading, and As I Lie Dying is one of those books that I return to again and again, and I see something new in it, I think every time. But that was really the first book of his that I felt, in that magical way that you want to feel when you read literary fiction.
Although you didn't think he portrayed black people very well.
No. Well, because I looked at the the black family in that book, right? I think they're the Dilsey, right? And they didn't have enough texture. They didn't feel real to me. Like I was trying to, I wanted them to be complicated, right? In the ways that all of his other characters are complicated. Even if they show up for half a page, his other characters who aren't black, they're always complicated. I think he's one of those writers who has that skill to, in 3 sentences, he can make you see and experience a full, whole person. And so I wanted that from his work when I read, his black characters, but I didn't necessarily get it. And I felt that again years later when I read Absalom, which I loved. I actually read the last, 100 pages of it all in one sitting. It was very intense. But I felt the same way, right? With the sort of the writing around the villain and the villain's, mother, right? Who is, a Placage, sort of woman from New Orleans, a woman of color from New Orleans. They weren't complicated. They were flat. So yes, it's a quibble that I have with his work.
Do you see it as your job to rectify that?
I think that part of what I am attempting to do is complicate all the people who I write about, right? Is to sort of make them live and breathe and sort of sweat and really inhabit the page so that the reader feels like they are with a real person, right? And so that they feel for that person and they feel with that person, even though that person may not resemble them in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's what I attempt to do in all my work, right?
Right, but as I recall, you didn't think anybody would want to read about people like that early on.
No.
You would write it, but you thought, well, who would be interested in this? Was it the MacArthur grant that changed the trajectory for you?
It wasn't the MacArthur, it was the National Book Award for Salvage the Bones. Because beforehand, when I wrote my first novel and I was shopping that novel around to different publishing companies, I was told there was no audience for it.
Who cares about these
right.
characters?
Like no one wants to read about these people. Sometimes I'd remember visiting one publishing company and them saying specifically that the paperback division said there was no audience for this. So that was the feedback that I was getting. And even though Salvage the Bones was easier to place because I'd had a Stegner Fellowship at that point, right? There were some, official, accolades that I had that made that an easier project, to conceivably sell, I still, there weren't many people who wanted to review it, right? So, but then publishing was a very different place then. So it was, the National Book Award that really, it changed my life. It really changed my life.
The backdrop for most of your stories, in addition to these characters, which I find are very complicated, but the backdrop of your stories seems, it's chaos. It seems like it. Families, they're loving, yet they're betraying one another. The weather always seems like there's a storm lurking in the background. There's so many references to fighting, and then there's gnats everywhere in your stories. There's just so much tension going on in the background in there, with these interesting little references to the peacefulness of a river. And so you're just stirring up all of this chaos, and I'm just thinking, is that what your life was like?
Yes. Yeah, it is. When I was growing up, my life was chaotic like that, right? You always feel like, the environment is trying to kill you, the place is trying to kill you in some way or another, right? Either there's a hurricane, or there's a thunderstorm, or there's a flood, or there's just a heat wave. Or when I was younger, right, we didn't have any, heat. So then the cold during the winter, even though it doesn't get as cold as Minnesota, still, it feels like the cold is just trying to freeze you. And then the bugs, you don't even want to talk about the bugs, right? So
well,
yeah.
You do.
So yeah, it always, yes, it's chaotic in that way. And yet, when I was younger, there's a river, which is the river that I start with in Where the Line Bleeds in my first novel, called the Wolf River. And so it runs through DeLille, I think it begins in central Mississippi, maybe northern Mississippi. And so it runs all the way down, and it runs through DeLille, and it sort of empties out in the DeLille sort of bayou. And when I was very young, some of my happiest memories are going like with my family, my mom, my dad, my grandmother, all her sisters and brothers and their kids. We would all go on this caravan up to this public stretch of beach along the river, and we just camp. And we're sort of sleeping in tents. I remember one of the tents that we were sleeping in, like, it didn't even have a bottom, so we're just like sleeping on the sand at the river. But there was something about that. Every time that we went to that place, something about that experience that was, I don't know, there was a tranquility, and there was a peacefulness, and there was a coming together in community, right? And there was like a safety there and a joy there that, I don't know, that I guess I'm trying to communicate in my work whenever I write about rivers, except in Let Us Descend, where the rivers are also trying to.
Rivers just as brutal
Yes.
in that one as everything else is. Yeah. So you've said that if you were going to assume responsibility of writing about your home and the people that you grew up around, that you would need narrative ruthlessness. What is narrative ruthlessness? Give me an example.
So,
you said you needed to be an Old Testament God, which I would love to know what that means.
The reason that I think that and that I've said that is because I feel like in my first novel, so my first novel centers around two brothers, they're twins. One is named Joshua, which is my brother's name, and the other one is Christoph, right? And so when I was writing that novel, I think that the characters, the two characters, especially the character named Joshua, I think they resembled my brother so much that, like, I love all my characters, but I really love that character, right? I really love those characters. And so it was hard for me to let the story become whatever it needed to become, to let it develop, right? There were so many bad things that could have, or trying, experiences that those characters could have had, and they didn't because I was trying to protect them. And so after...
And you were protecting your memory of him, right, and your love for him, right?
Right.
Okay.
And after I wrote Where the Line Bleeds, I sort of figured out that that's one of the things that perhaps was not working so well in Where the Line Bleeds, because I didn't let go, right? And so when I sat down to write Salvage the Bones, I thought, okay, I can't protect my characters, right? If I'm gonna take on this responsibility of writing about the people that I write about, then I have to be honest about their lives, right? I have to be honest about the kinds of hardships that they face, right? I think that if I had tried to write Salvage the Bones when I was younger, I probably wouldn't have killed off their mom. Like, maybe their mother would have been alive, right? Because who wants to kill off, who wants to kill off the character's mom? But I did it because that was the story that needed to be told.
Did you get any pushback from family or your community or something when you maybe portrayed them with this ruthlessness? I'm thinking about Alice Walker when Color Purple came out, and her portrayal of black men didn't go over very well. So did you get much pushback on that?
Generally, I don't in my fiction. Generally I don't in my fiction. Though I did get some pushback from the memoir, right? But that's because it's true life, right?
Yeah, that was your nonfiction.
Right. It's based in reality. So I don't know. Earlier on in my career, I would worry about that, right? I think especially with my first novel, I thought, what if people sort of take these characters and then sort of extrapolate from these characters and make broad generalizations about the kinds of people that I'm writing about, right? About kids like this. But then, I don't know, I just feel like I have to tell the truth, right? And as long as I do so with respect for the characters I'm writing about, and also try to write about them with tenderness at the same time, try to complicate them, right? And, make them as complex as I can, then hopefully that will counteract, I guess, that urge that the reader might feel to make generalizations about the characters.
Well, there's so much brutality in what you write, but also, just like in describing the weather, there's also this stream of tenderness, especially at the end of most of your novels. There's this sense of, there's a hopeful, tender, redemptive kind of time at there. So I'm wondering about this. You went through a season of self-loathing. I'm assuming it's okay to talk about this because you've written about it.
Yeah.
So you were saying that as a young black woman, you felt like the world despised you and you didn't trust anyone, and that life was just a colossal disappointment. All women were angry and working and worried. All men were angry and resentful and wanting a different life. You didn't trust your parents, society, and each other. Did writing help you climb out of that?
I think it did. Because
In what way?
because when you write, you learn to look at the whole person, I think, and to realize again that people are complicated, right? I think I got a lot of clarity, especially around that. Yes, when I wrote my novels, but especially when I wrote Men We Reaped, because writing that book meant that I couldn't just live with the ideas that I had about the people around me anymore, and that I had to be more curious and more inquisitive and, complicate the people in my life that I think most of us don't complicate, right? Like our parents, right? But writing the memoir made me, more aware of the fact, that my parents are just people, right? That my mom was once young and she had her own dreams about what she thought her life would be like. But then this was the reality of her childhood. And while she had these hopes, like this happened when she was a teenager. So I don't know. I think a lot of the work that I did with making the people I love into characters, because you have to make them into characters when you're writing a memoir. But a lot of that work that I did, I think it sort of changed my way of understanding the world and of understanding people.
And that was helpful in a mental health kind of way?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And too, I think I think that I couldn't sustain that kind of nihilism, especially because when I looked at not only my parents, but when I looked at like my grandparents and my, grandparents' siblings, and looked at their lives and what they lived through and how they thrived in spite of everything around them, right? And then I looked at my great-grandparents and all the things that, all the stories that I heard about their lives. The only reason that I'm here is because of them. And, and not, like I had to see, to understand that not only did they sort of struggle, but they held on to hope, right? They had faith. They, didn't reduce the world to just material absolutes. Like they believed in the existence of the divine and of, they believed that life was complicated and could contain awe and could be wondrous. And so, so I had to acknowledge all that. And I think, that helped me sort of move through that phase.
Sure. In writing Let Us Descend, I think you asked yourself the question, is there room for another book on the topic of slavery? What did Ta-Nehisi Coates tell you that said yes?
Because I actually asked him that because I was interviewing him for an article that I was writing for Vanity Fair when his novel, The Water Dancer, was about to come out. And I was working on Let Us Descend at the time. I had also just read Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, right? So I thought, maybe this isn't the story that I should tell. Like, maybe there's no room for this story. Maybe readers don't want, this story. And also at the same time, at least in social media spaces, there has been like a fair amount of pushback, right, towards stories about enslaved people. And so I was having this conversation with Ta-Nehisi, and I remember asking him, like, I'm working on this book right now, should I not? Like, should I not write this? And he was like, Jesmyn, there were millions of enslaved people. He was like, that means there are millions of stories to tell, because each one of those, enslaved people, they had their own story. They had their own particular story. And so he told me that, and it was one of those moments where it feels like I needed someone to give me permission. And also, I felt it as like a vote of confidence, right? You can do this. You can tell this difficult story.
Speaking of Vanity Fair, you wrote such a breathtaking essay about the death of your partner in Vanity Fair, but you were trying to write Let Us Descend when your partner died. And then I think I read somewhere that you thought, forget it, I'm done. A, why did you think you were done as a writer? And B, what got you going again?
So this all happened in 2020. So my partner passed in January of 2020. And, we had 2 children together, right? At the time, my oldest was 4, my oldest was 7, my youngest was 3. And no one ever plans on, their partner dying and raising their kids alone, and then having to sort of navigate raising children and nurturing children who are grieving, right? As everyone knows, in 2020, right, with the shutdown and with the pandemic, I was not writing. I just stopped. And that was different for me, because ever since, 2003, I had developed, when I was at the University of Michigan, I developed a real sense of discipline around writing. It's something that I did 5 days a week, 2 hours a day in and day out, right, for years and years and years. And so to then, lose my partner in 2020 and then just stop, in part because I was, those first weeks and months, when you lose someone that you love, you're just crazy with grief, right?
You're just unmoored.
Yeah, you're just unmoored. And I couldn't write. And I think with, the state of the world at that time, I just felt real hopelessness and a sense of despair. And so I went so long without writing. I think this was, July, maybe August, right? I just hadn't gone that long without writing in such a long time that I thought, okay, I talk to myself a lot. So I thought, is this it? Are you done? Because I didn't feel the urge, right? I was just so mired in despair. I didn't want to put anything to paper. I didn't want to create. I didn't want to write. It's almost as if I just saw no use in it. And so I just asked myself, okay, is this it? And then immediately, that same voice that spoke to me when I was on that plane said, no. Like the last thing, because my partner's name is Brandon, but I called him B. And so the voice was like, the last thing that B would want is for his leaving to silence you. So I said, okay. So I guess I'm doing this again. And so then I dove back into Let Us Descend. And at that point, I had been working on Let Us Descend since 2015, I want to say. But I spent so much of that time reading and researching because I knew nothing about, slavery, that I only had maybe 2 or 3 chapters written by 2020. And so when I dove back in to writing it, it was almost like I had to start all over again. But in a way, when I talk about Let Us Descend, I like to say, because this is true, that's the story that I had to write at that moment. Because I think one of the most striking things to me about Annis, the enslaved young woman who's at the heart of this book, and the enslaved people around her, is that they are constantly dealing with grief after grief after grief after grief, right? As they're losing people who they love, either to death or because they're sold away from each other or they're separated, right? So they're experiencing that emotion of grief again and again and again. And in part, to me, one of the things that Annis sort of realizes, along her journey in the book, is she realizes that life is worth living. And it's a choice that she realizes that she has to make every day, right? When she gets up, she has to make that choice to live and to resist the despair, right, that surrounds her. So I really feel like I had to write her story because she helped me to get to that same realization by the end.
Well, it's essentially a book about grief written by a woman who was grieving.
Right.
And it's powerful. It is very, very powerful. So, recent events, this is a complete non sequitur here, but we're running out of time. Recent events have made things like diversity and equity and inclusion, I see you inhaling here, problematic.
Right.
What do you make of that?
I think it's ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I think that, this country is not without its problems, right? But one of its strengths have always been its diversity, right? And its inclusiveness, right? And all the people, right, who have come here one way or another have all made this country a richer, more beautiful place. And so, I don't know, it angers me, and I think it's ridiculous, and I intend to continue to do the work.
Good for you.
Thank
you. We actually need your voice. So, yes, please. So we're going to start wrapping this up, and we have a lot of people who are here, who are writers, wannabe writers, people who will be watching this, who want to just get better at it. Give us your best advice.
I would say, do not silence yourself, right? This industry can be very difficult. You will face a lot of rejection, right? Many people will tell you no, right? That they don't want to publish your work. They don't, whether it's short story, novel, book, whatever, right? They don't want to publish it. They don't think it's right for them. But I think it's important to remember that hundreds of people can tell you no, but you only need one person to tell you yes, right? You need one person to look at your work, understand what it's trying to accomplish, and then that one person will open a door for you, right? So your job is to get your work to that point, right? To do whatever you can to improve as a writer, right? To make your work the best that it can be, and then to risk yourself and be vulnerable and put it out there again and again and again and again until you find that one person who will say yes.
Jesmyn Ward, thank you for being at our Writers Symposium.